Hello, everybody. It's me, Fee, or Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter from my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story. And I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who write such complimentary messages below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, when I was 11 years old, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. The following day, Audrey wanted to go to Skibbereen, our nearest small town, to buy some provisions, and she took us with her. By now we'd been joined by a young Englishman called Julian, who was an old family friend of the Barnbys and about 28 years old and single. While Audrey did her grocery shopping, I bought myself a pair of much-needed tackies, as mine had gone down with seagull in the River Ald in the mud, but they'd been pretty worn out, having been bought for me by Mum from W.G. Brown & Co. for playing tennis at school, and which had now disintegrated almost entirely. Sorry, I'm reading so badly today. Don't know why. Then we went to watch the Cliff Richard film, Summer Holiday, giving Audrey a chance to finish her shopping in peace and get her hair done as well. We came home to find that one of the stone gateposts had been knocked right over, and the pieces of broken stone lying in the narrow lane. Henry was contentedly reading the newspaper, a cup of tea in his hand, having had a peaceful day. He'd been left to take delivery of oil for the Aga. That's the kind of stove they use in some parts there, and had dozed off, possibly after a couple of gins before his lunch. The tanker driver had arrived, and since there was no room to turn a large lorry into the very narrow driveway into Ballylinchy House from the equally narrow road, he knocked over one of the stone gateposts. Finding nobody around, he filled the tank next to the kitchen with the oil, leaving an invoice on the kitchen table, and subsequently left. Audrey then went to check the tank level for the Aga to find it was still empty, and fearing the worst, had then checked the tank that held the oil for the central heating system. That was full to the brim. She was furious, and we heard a lot of shouting. After quite a bit of this, Henry came through to the sitting room where the four of us, Miles, myself, Francis, and Julian, were gathered rather apprehensively. Audrey's gone to bed with a headache, he told us sheepishly. He was to ring the oil company to get the Arga oil in and the central heating tank drained and washed out. He would be cooking the evening meal and would like volunteers to help. I jumped up and offered my services as a co-cook, having had all that training and at finishing school, and the others said they'd help too. After Henry had been on the phone to the local oil supplier in a very heated discussion, the lorry came back, knocking over the second gatepost after a lot of laborious manoeuvring and leaving yet another heap of broken stones lying in the lane. There was a lot of fuss as the oil was sorted out and finally pumped into the correct tank. Henry came into the sitting room, where I suddenly found myself alone. The others, knowing that Audrey was about to erupt again, had craftily slipped away to Murphy's Bar, the only pub in Baltimore. Audrey had left all the ingredients for steak and kidney pie out on the big scrubbed pine kitchen table for us, as well as a child's recipe book open at the relevant page, showing a photograph of a steak and kidney pie with the method on the opposite page, and we set to. I might have overstated my culinary skills to Henry and Audrey, having boasted that I was now a cordon bleu cook after my term at Old Fontenette, finishing school in Switzerland, because I now pored over the recipe book, completely mystified. Clearly, Henry had got to the age of about 50 without ever having to cook in his life. That had always been Audrey's department. So we both ploughed on and followed the very simple monosyllabic instructions as best we could, neither admitting to the other that we were completely out of our depth. Somehow, when it came to making the pastry for the pie crust, one of us, using our sticky fingers covered in wet flour, managed to glue 2 or 3 pages together. As the method continued onto the following page, and we must have skipped the rest of the pastry recipe, ending up on the page for dumplings or something similar. Anyway, the result, even before we put the raw pie into the oven, was a glutinous, gluey brown mess, which could have been mistaken for wallpaper paste, with bits of raw onion and carrot welded to the meat mixture in a most unappetizing fashion. "This doesn't look right," sighed Henry, exasperated and tired after his hideous day, and longing by now for a stiff whiskey. "But I'm sure it'll look all right once it's been baked." And so we left it in the Arga, and he and I retired to the sitting room with its glorious views over the estuary and islands for a well-earned drink. About an hour later, the others arrived back from Murphy's Bar, distinctly mellow and decidedly hungry. With some trepidation, I pulled the steak and kidney pie out of the oven and looked at it with utter dismay. It lurked, flat and pallid, at the bottom of the big Pyrex dish, and I called Henry into the kitchen for his opinion. He'd got stuck into the whiskey during the hour it was supposed to be baking, and I, knowing nothing about Argas, had taken a wild guess as to what oven temperature to use. I now bitterly regretted having boasted so much about my cordon bleu skills. Clearly, I'd given Henry the impression that I knew exactly what I was doing. I poked at the gooey grey sludge with a spatula. It didn't give at all, even after I'd rammed a carving fork into it as hard as I could. The thing was absolutely solid, and we couldn't even prise it out of the dish, as neither of us had thought to grease it first. We'd already skipped several pages by mistake by that stage. "Oh, hell," slurred Henry, "bugger it. We'll just serve it up and hope nobody noticed that it's a bit leathery." That was an understatement of the texture of the so-called pastry. One could have paved a driveway with it. Just then, Audrey reappeared from her lie-down upstairs, also hungry and ready for supper. She'd left everything so well prepared that even an idiot couldn't have gone wrong. "Is this the pie?" she asked, as she prodded it suspiciously with a fork. We both nodded. She walked over to the recipe book and looked carefully at where we'd left it open after we'd finished with it. "Why are you using a recipe for dumplings?" she demanded. I distinctly remembering leaving it open on the pie page. Henry fled back to the sitting room and the whiskey bottle, and Audrey erupted, following him with a volley of castigation, leaving me to slink off to my own bedroom upstairs and quietly close the door. After what I felt was a safe interval, I came back downstairs to find the pie still embedded in its dish, in the bin, and the family eating bread and cheese and drinking wine in great gulps. "Audrey's taken the whiskey bottle to bed with her," explained Henry. "I think she's got another headache." We were in the middle of a heat wave, a term that made me cackle mockingly when all the locals discussed the fact that they hadn't had a drop of rain for 3 weeks, whilst I insisted that a proper heat wave was no rain for several months, and the temperature never dipping between 50 or 40 degrees centigrade, even at night. It was perfect holiday weather for us, though, and we certainly made the most of it, going out in the boat every day, just wearing our bathing costumes. I wore my tiny black French bikini and was already tanned and nut brown from my summer in Switzerland. After 3 days, Henry decided that his bait must be ready and well salted by now. So, while Miles loaded the half-dozen or so lobster pots into the boat, Henry handed me a bucket and asked me to go and fetch some salted herrings for baiting the pots. I walked over to the barrel, which was standing in the full sunshine, and plunged my hand in, elbow deep. I felt something warm and slimy wriggling right up my arm and hastily withdrew it. My whole bare arm was covered in fat, stinking, writhing maggots. I screamed and ran down to the water's edge to try and wash them off, but couldn't reach the water as the tide was too low, and so I had to race down the slipway and dive into the sea and swim like crazy so that they couldn't crawl after me. I didn't mind snakes, spiders, or bats, but worms and caterpillars send me into a nervous wreck of fright and horror. Henry was clutching his sides with laughter, and even kind, gentle Miles was laughing at me, while I very crossly got out of the water and shouted at them, "If you want bait, you could damn well get it yourselves," and then went back into the water as I could still feel the repulsive creatures creeping on my skin. What Henry had omitted to do was to check the pattern in which the sun moved around the shed when he set up his free bait system in the first place and put the barrel in a cool place. He'd left it in the shade of the hut, but forgot that the sun moves round, and his bait had been quietly festering in the heat every day, attracting every fly in Southern Ireland. On another occasion, Miles and I were out in the punt, about as far out in the bay as he deemed safe, and were anchored, happily fishing for mackerel, having already set out the 6 or so lobster pots baited with rotting fish, each with its orange buoy marking where it was. I was gazing into the dark green water when a huge shape, twice the size of our boat, drifted by just underneath us. "Did you see that?" I asked Miles nervously. "What?" I pointed as a massive shape drifted past us again, closer this time. "Oh, that's just a basking shark," he said casually, and carried on fishing. "A shark?" I screamed in alarm and scrambled over him, getting ready to pull up the anchor and start up the recalcitrant old outboard. Yep, Miles is laid back at the best of times, but this seemed suicidal to me. "For Christ's sake, we've got to get out of here," I screamed. "Have you seen the size of that thing?" "No, we're fine," he said lazily, still wiggling his mackerel line. "How can we be fine if there's a shark that could eat our entire boat in one mouthful right beneath us?" I wailed. "You've got to get us out of here." Miles yawned and said, "They're harmless." "How do you mean harmless? It's a bloody great shark and we're done for." I was beside myself. Sharks were very much a big danger in South Africa, and bathers had been taken by them by the dozen every summer holiday when all the Wali's came to Durban for their 2 weeks at the beach. There were great whites, Zambezi sharks, and ragged tooths, raggies galore, all of which were man-eaters and lethal. Our local newspaper was always carrying headlines describing how people had been taken, often just in knee-deep water, off the Durban bathing beaches. How could Miles be so casual? He continued to ignore my pleading, and eventually the vast shape drifted off and out of sight as I followed its every move nervously. Miles never bothered to elaborate on the fact that the basking shark isn't a shark at all, just a huge fish that filter feeds on plankton. But I was on the point of a nervous breakdown at the time, which must have amused him enormously. It had been payback for all the times I'd frightened him with songololos and such like. That's enough for today. There's lots more to come about Ireland. I hope you enjoyed it. Sorry I read it so badly. It's just one of those things. And thanks so much to John Moslane for being my sound engineer. Goodbye. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.